I talked about doing some videos on tactics of monsters. So let's do that. I was actually talking to some friends today about the Blob of Annihilation. So I'm in the mood for that. Let's jump into the Blob of Annihilation and just really quickly see, if you're a DM, how would you run this? So the Blob of Annihilation is a pretty interesting monster with some quirks, and this is an advanced monster, right? So we're talking about something that's quite challenging to run as compared to monsters like an ogre or something like that. So the more that you are a new DM, the more that guidance or thinking through this will be helpful to you, because it is so much of a monster, so much to handle and take on and do well, so that it's a thrilling challenge. It's also a high CR monster, so it's going to be facing against harder adventurers, right, that are more skilled and have a lot of capabilities that may thwart your plans at making this a challenging encounter. So here I am in my adventure encounter and monster design tools spreadsheet. See my previous video on that. And I am, and again, thank you to Patreon supporters for making this possible. And so let's do a Blob of Annihilation fight using this so we can see what kind of CRs we're talking about, right? And you could also use the math in the 2024 DMG to do this as well. The Blob of Annihilation is CR 23. So that means a full party, 6 characters at level 16 would find this to be a high challenge. And again, the levels are low, moderate, and high. And the way this works is that if I go to level 15, it's above the maximum, right? It's 50,000 XP, and you're not supposed to go over 46,800. So you'd have to have a very, very strong level 15 party to face it by the rules. When we get into 17, it's still going to be a high challenge for them. 18, it's a moderate challenge. So it starts dropping down as we get to level 18. Level 19 party, 6 characters is still moderate. And at 20th level, it is still moderate. So it's supposed to be a decent fight at all these different levels. But now you know what you're dealing with, right? You're dealing with above level 16 on up that you're going to be doing that, because over 15 it would be too high. So that's the first thing you want to know is, can I throw this at my party? And you'd want to be looking at level 16 PCs on up. So this is the end of the game. And if you want to add more to this Blob of Annihilation, like it's supported by flying creatures or something like that, then you will have to use the math to figure out whether that is supported as well. Or if you're kind of the DM that just wings everything, just know that, well, that's what this monster is. And so at level 16, it is a high challenge. I like looking at the math of it. This is 50,000 XP by the book, and the total is 58,000. So we're high on high. we are at the upper end of what a level 16 party is supposed to, by the book, be able to face off against. All right, so we get a really cool, looking at the stat block, we get a really cool picture of it. And if you see this thing is enormous, right? This ginormous blob that is above, like swarming around various houses in a town or village, right? So that is significant. So let's talk about the lore that comes with the monster, because sometimes the lore can really give us a good description of what the monster is about, how it is expected to act, ideas that can help us formulate encounters, and so on. I will note that in 2024, we often get less information than in 2014. So if you have your 2014 monster manual and the monster appears there, you can look at that tome sometimes for better information on how to run your encounters, unfortunately. But in this case, this is only a new monster. It doesn't exist in the 2014 version. So what's it tell us? This is the coagulation of cosmic entropy conjoined to the remains of dead gods. Huh? Yes. So yeah, it is the remains of dead gods and weird cosmic energies coalescing, and it's malicious, and it drifts through wild space between worlds, across the multiverse. Okay. But apparently, disasters or nihilistic magic users can summon it to inhabited realms. When unleashed there, then it goes across the land. It will splinter off parts of itself. So that kind of explain why they're different sizes. We'll talk about the gargantuan size in a second. It will consume anything it encounters. Within the blob is an expanse without air or gravity where entropic forces destroy whatever they engulf. Nothing can survive for long. Okay. Only magic items and the corpses of gods and titans can endure inside the blob. And what they tell us is here, sometimes a quest can be someone says, hey, you've got to go into this thing and retrieve a thing inside of it. So that's kind of fun. And that is a neat idea. It doesn't just have to be like a quest giver. It can be something like, if there was a well that is said to destroy anything and the characters, toss an item in there, but then later they realize they need it back. Or if they have a choice of encounters and they go one way, but the other way was destroyed by this blob of annihilation, but also sucked up the item they need, right? Now, it was in the town that you ran away from the blob of annihilation, but actually that town had the item you need. And that could be a thing to even do in a campaign across levels. Like when you were lower level, you made it away, but that thing ate up the, holy chalice of saving the campaign, and now you need it and you're higher level, so get in there. Yeah, possible. So there's some ideas there of what we can do. And then there is a table here of like what could be inside of it. So the idea that you could have, some fun things here, and that's kind of it. So we don't get a whole lot of like tactics other than it's malicious and it'll eat anything it can. That doesn't give us a lot of direction, but it sure gives us a lot of flexibility. It seems kind of mindless, especially once you look at its stat block. So it's here as a horrible force bent on absorption of all the things. Now, maybe it's headed towards a particular location. So this is things we can bring into it. We can think, hey, is it trying to destroy the town? Like eat every bit of it? Has it been directed in something like straight line, right? And the town is across its path. It will carve through that path. Can it be guided away from its path, drawn towards something else shiny, I don't know, delicious that it wants to eat? We can think through things like that, but we don't have to worry overly about tactics. This thing just wants to eat everything in its course. And so what it'll probably do is the kind of thinking that dumb things do. Attack the thing that attacked you last, head in the direction either you're already heading or whatever seems like you should eat it, the most things, right? Probably will try to eat the most creatures possible and use tactics that way. It is very dangerous, so even if it isn't super smart, it shouldn't do things that make it a low threat, because we expect that high threat. And our players, and their characters are super smart, and they're always going to be bringing their A game. So even if we are not a genius blob of annihilation, we want to play it so it's effective, right? That's always important. But yeah, that's the description. Let's take a look at the stat block. And stands out immediately to me, not just the art, but it's labeled gargantuan. And gargantuan is a tricky size, because it turns out that what gargantuan really means is it is at least 20 by 20 on a map. But it can be bigger than that. So that really matters if, as it does, it has powers that involve having things inside of it. Being able to move outside of that blob's area will be harder if you make it really like the size of a city block, right? Versus if you make it 20 by 20, a little easier to escape. So think through that when you run your blob of annihilation. And as we talk about these other points, because the size you decide to make it, and legally you can make it the size of a city block or whatever you want, well, that's going to matter. We've got an armor class of 18. So as things go, not super hard to hit for something that's CR 23, but also not a piece of cake, right? People can miss it. It has a very fast initiative. It has hit points that are fairly high, as overall creatures go, but it is CR 23. We see its abilities. It has a really low intelligence and charisma. The dexterity is not particularly impressive. So its initiative comes from being sort of specialized in initiative. But it's going to be really about the ability of its hit points versus how much damage it can dish out based on what we're seeing so far. I always make note of the resistances and immunities. Nothing particularly impressive on resistances, but, typical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing resistance. And it is immune to acid, necrotic, poison, charmed, exhaustion, frightened. So a lot of conditions and a lot of damage types. And that is sort of surprising. So if you're running this as a campaign, I would immediately make a note if you know that, the warlock is always doing acid damage or necrotic damage, or the rogue always likes to poison their weapons or has these poisoned attacks. Well, that's going to go poorly. That's going to be a surprise. So it's good to keep in mind. And then these conditions will often be imposed by either attacks or spells, right? So if they're using weapon masteries to knock your blob prone, that is not going to happen on the Blob of Annihilation. And they're also not going to be able to use a spell that stuns or paralyzes it or restrains it even. So that's important to note. Senses, it has blind sight. So I'm making a note of that to go, okay, it knows where everybody is. It doesn't matter if they're invisible or hiding. It can sense their location, right? And in D&D Beyond, you can see, what that means if you click on it. So that is the upper stat block, right? Looking at those pieces, what really stands out to me is sort of its hit point total, and how quickly I think the party can churn through it. And then the fact that it doesn't have, other than strength and con, none of its abilities are particularly strong. And then these bunch of resistances and immunities I have to track. So I've got to be careful about that. With a list this big, pretty much anything that happens, any condition damage, I'm just going to look it up. Making a note, I've got to check that out. It's also probably going to go fairly early in initiative with a plus 16, right? On average, a 26 initiative roll if you just roll a 10. Now let's get to the traits section. I always, when I'm looking at a monster, I'm looking at this as well. I'm looking at the astral implosion. So if it's reduced to 0 hit points, it's going to implode and eject any creatures that are engulfed by it into the astral sea. That's where I go, wait, do I want this for my campaign to say have some number of party members from 0 to 1 in the astral sea? Am I okay with that? Then it's going to cover everything in slime within 600 feet, and it's going to reappear in 1d20 years. So you're not actually defeating it. So for story reasons, you have to bring about its demise. You would need to add some additional piece, like by holding the amulet of sacred blah, 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 you actually do destroy it, or some other explanation if your quest concept requires really, truly vanquishing. If it's just saving the town, go right ahead, this works fine. But you have to think through that piece of when this ends, some number of characters may be in the astral sea, and maybe that's fine. If it's not, you might want to just remove this. It's your game. You can change whatever you want, but I'm prepping this. I'm looking at that and I'm thinking about whether I want that. And if not, I might change it up. Next is the fact that it has 4 legendary resistances. So when it fails a saving throw, it's going to roll a saving throw. If it fails it, I get to decide. If I spend one of these, there's no action. It just makes that saving throw. One of the things that happens with legendary resistances is that you can use it to thwart characters, but also kind of to reward them. Like if there's a character that is deliberately trying to burn through these legendary resistances, it can be cool to play along with them and make them feel good for the fact that they are burning through these. It's a blob. It's not super intelligent, so why not? If you're trying to goad it in to use up some legendary resistances, sure, it might do so. On the other hand, it might be dumb enough that it doesn't even know whether it should or shouldn't. So, it won't necessarily fall for a trick. Now, I'll give you an example of this. Recently, I was playing a game where I was fighting a god, right? We were fighting a god as our party. And I used the command spell on this god to command it to grovel, level 1 spell. It failed the save, and it chose to burn a legendary resistance because it couldn't even, it couldn't imagine complying with that command, right? It was just, and I knew that from a role-playing perspective. So it was very fun because the DM and I were on the same page of like, it can't let itself fail this. So it's going to burn through it so that one of my friends can hit it with a really important saving throw. And I'm just burning this command because I've got it around. So that's an example of how the player and DM can be on the same page and have fun that way with legendary resistances. It is also magic resistant, so advantage on saves versus spells. So first of all, it's going to get 2 rolls on any spell, and if it fails it, then it's going to get to decide whether to use legendary resistance, which is 4 times per day, not the usual 3. All right, that's all important stuff that I'll note. I like to print out my monsters and highlight them. I don't love burning through paper, but for monsters, I'll make an exception, and I will highlight the things I want. Or you could do it on a screen if that's how you run, however it is, but I would make a note of these types of things. Next, we've got the action block. So with the action block, it's important to note, I always, when I'm reviewing a monster, I want to know what is its sort of suggested multi-attack sequence, and then what else is it there that maybe I use sometimes conditionally to do it. So in the action section, it has multi-attack, which is pretty complex, 2 pseudopod attacks, and engulf. But it can replace one of its attacks with a use of Restraining Glob. And the way I would read this is probably what it can do is replace one pseudopod attack with Restraining Glob, but maybe in theory it could do any of the 3, but you'll probably want to do your engulf. So really you for sure will do one pseudopod attack and one engulf, and then you're going to do either a second pseudopod or Restraining Glob. That's how I look at it. What does pseudopod bring to the table? Plus 15 to hit, reasonable. It deals 24 force damage with it. Nothing to write home about, but it does have a reach of 30 feet, and that is going to come into play with its tactics, as we'll soon see. But I make a note of that. Wow, like it can reach 30 feet, not 5, not 10, 30. So it can really reach out to something, and that's a thing I want to role play. I'm often looking in the stat block, what kind of tells the story of this creature? So, you can just imagine this glob thing reaching out and grabbing that or hitting that player, making some kind of sound effect noise, whatever you feel comfortable with. But this is, a bread and butter attack to go out there and 30 feet hit it. One thing else to think about is this is not one of these that is ranged or melee. So I currently don't have a super strong melee attack, but stay tuned. Next is Engulf. So this is complicated. Big wall of text here. It's going to move up to its speed. And it can move through the spaces of huge or smaller creatures and objects, which is, that's pretty much all characters are going to fall into that category. They get a strength saving throw, DC 23. Each creature or object whose space the blob enters for the first time during this move. Whew. Right there. We're just like in a couple sentences, it's complicated. But what it means is, hey, I can move, as we could see up here, 30 feet and around. That's my speed. But in addition, during my action, when I do the engulf, I move another 30 feet, and I can move through the spaces of creatures. All those creatures who I just entered, only just now, they make this strength saving throw with a very high DC, right? Very hard to hit. So this is going to be difficult. So you can kind of think of most targets will likely fail their saving throw. So what does that mean? If they fail, they are engulfed. While engulfed, they have total cover against attacks and other effects outside the blob. This is a little weirdly worded, because let's say there are 2 creatures inside the blob. Does that mean they can affect each other? Maybe? Yes. By reading this, yes. I don't know that's what the result should be. So I would actually probably change this. If I were running at home, I would say both inside and outside the blob. But it's up to you, or maybe it requires a check. It's up to you. The big question I'd be asking myself here is, let's say you wanted to heal a character inside the blob. Do you have to be inside the blob to do it? And can you then do it? Or can you not do it because you're both kind of somewhere inside the blob? I might require a spellcasting check of some sort, right? Like religion if you're a cleric, or arcane if you're a wizard, to pull that off. Like, I want to cast shield on, or well, not shield, but I want to cast some sort of, wizard spell on my friend. Can I do that? Or I'm a cleric and I want to heal my friend. I might require a check. Or you could run by the rules, and here what it says is that inside the blob you can do it, outside you can't. So that's totally cool. But that's an important thing to know. So total cover is the first thing. And when the blob moves it with it. None of this is terrible, but we've got a second paragraph. The other thing is a non-magical object is destroyed. So kind of houses and any number of things, carts, stuff like that will just get destroyed slowly but surely. And that's another role-playing part that we can discuss as Engulf is happening, how it's tearing away the wood on the houses. And there's this cart there on the ground that it has eaten up, and it's just slowly tearing it apart. The wheel pops off, all that. You can slowly describe those things. But the second paragraph of Engulf is, while engulfed, a creature takes 21 force damage at the start of each of its turns. And it's suffocating, and it's restrained. Restrained's a big deal because what that means with restrained is it's going to be at disadvantage on its attacks, and things have advantage to hit it. Right? The other thing is your speed is 0, as you can see here, and disadvantage on dex saves. So all worth noting. The suffocating part isn't super big deal because characters can actually hold their breath for a pretty long time. But, maybe you come up with some reason why you make that a bigger deal. Or what it also means is anything that's inside of it that somehow wouldn't be killed by the 21 force damage will eventually suffocate. So, don't know when that would come up, but maybe. An engulfed creature that's reduced to 0 hit points dissolves into ash, ejected into the astral sea. So if you wanted to bring back someone to life that was killed, well, you probably need a really, really high level spell because they're like ash spread in the astral sea. Yeah, it's rough. But if you succeed, you are actually ejected into nearest unoccupied space. And that takes us back to that question of how big is this thing? Because you might be able to actually move quite a bit to where you are taking, like all the characters might be inside of it, except they often are getting shunted to an edge, right? You move 30 feet and they get shunted out if they make their saving throw. So it's worth keeping in mind. So just pseudopods and engulf, not bad on the damage track, but it could be a lot worse, right? And actually, let's take a look at that analysis. So if you saw my previous video on breaking down the math of the monster manual, in it, I took down the mathematics behind every monster, not just at CR23, but across the entire book. But for the CR23 creatures, we have 5 of them in the 2024-2025 monster manual. And the average damage that they do is, let me find it here. The average damage per round is 231. If we include kind of big air effect things. Otherwise, it's 195. And the Blob of Annihilation comes in at 180 through the combination of all the different things it can do. And here what I was doing is assuming that it's going to hit twice with its pseudopod, and it's going to engulf 2 creatures, and then it will be able to do its legendary actions on top of that, which we'll get to in a bit. So it has the capacity to actually do a fair amount more of damage if it can engulf enough creatures, but I figure the kind of 16th level characters that are facing this probably will have some tricks up their sleeves to get out. So this is probably a decent assumption. But let's take a look. But okay, so just to say, on the order of the damage that it's dealing, it's a bit low for the CR23 average that's in the 2024. So the average it does is 180, and what we recommended in Forge of Foes is 186. So it's just a little under that. It's reasonable, which means that if you can execute on the plan of this monster, you should be able to challenge with it, right? It's not too bad. It should be a fun, good challenge for its CR. So let's talk about what else it does, because one of the things that immediately comes to mind when you've got this kind of engulf business and the 30-foot pseudopods is you think, well, all I need to do is stay far away from it, and it can't get me. And that's where Restraining Glob comes into the mix. Restraining Glob is what it can do instead of its multi-attack, but also, if we go back and remember, it said the blob makes 2 pseudopod attacks and engulf, but it can substitute a pseudopod for a Restraining Glob. So what does Restraining Glob do? The blob lobs a slimy glob at one large or smaller creature within 600 feet of itself. So there's the range of attack, and it's enormous range. So it lobs some chunk of goo, and it's a dexterity saving throw 23. And if it fails, it takes acid damage, and then it rolls the target 60 feet straight towards the blob, and the target is restrained. So if it's thinking about flying or running and fighting, well, it's got news, because not only is it moving 30 feet forward and 30 feet with an engulf, but the Restraining Glob will bring you 60 feet towards it. So that's going to be a surprise for those characters that are expecting to be very far away, because it will pull them and restrain them, which means more chances that it'll be able to then go over itself. Now, tactically, here's where we start getting into thinking through the battlefield conditions, right? We've got the ingredients we needed, but I'm not going to do that yet. I'm just going to simply note as I'm reviewing this, that this relies a lot on movement, right? Like, we need to move to engulf so that we can be doing that 21 damage around as often as possible. Plus, it's totally in character of this Blob of Annihilation. It wants to suck you into yourself So that means that the Restraining Glob will pull you in so it can engulf. Ideally, what it would do is move 30 feet, Restraining Glob the thing that's far away so that you're close, use a pseudopod, right, to hit something that's within 30 feet, and then engulf to get as many of those things, some of which it will now have dealt damage to twice, right? And then they're all engulfed. They're now restrained inside of it. And then at the beginning of their turns, they will take this damage. And they're all restrained, so everything's at disadvantage. That's the perfect picture going on there. Now, let's look at its legendary actions before we round this out and think about the terrain and things like that. So it has 3 legendary actions, and it will use these, as all legendary actions are used, immediately after a creature ends the turn. So when I know I'm running a legendary monster, I just literally think to myself, whenever another creature ends a turn, I ask myself whether I want to go, right? And then I need somewhere that I can track my 1, 2, 3s. Whether I'm just tracking it carefully in my mind, or I have tokens, or a little piece of paper and I'm scratching things off, 1, 2, 3, and then draw a line through it. Whatever works. But you need to be effective, you've got to track those legendary actions and need to constantly think to yourself, okay, turn ended, do I want to go? So a PC ends its turn, or some other creature ends its turn. What do I want to do? I have 3 options. Decay allows the blob to deal 14 necrotic to each creature engulfed by it. And the blob can't do this again until the start of its next turn. So this is a pretty big deal, right? Because if you think of, let's say I could get 4 creatures inside of me. They're going to take 21 at the start of their turn. But whenever one of those characters ends a turn, I can say, and I'm using Decay, and everybody takes 14. No save, nothing, just another 14. That takes the 21 to 35. 35 damage around for, the level 16 characters, it starts adding up. It will start tearing through some hit points with that, in addition to all the other attacks you're making. So it's a very important part of the mix, but you can only do it once per turn. So you want to do it whenever you think you've got the most people engulfed, which will probably be the idea that you will engulf, somebody will go, and you will decay, right? That's probably how it's going to turn out. The chances that waiting longer and then doing decay, well, it depends on these other legendary actions. So let's take a look. One of which is Grasping Glob. You use Restraining Glob, and you only can do this once. So it could be worth not doing decay immediately if you think characters aren't going to get out, and which is possible since they're restrained and stuff like that. And you could Grasping Glob one more person in, right? So maybe you used Grasping Blob to bring somebody far away inside. You move, you engulf, you pseudopod, then someone else goes, and then you think I can Grasping Glob one more, and then after the next person's turn, I can do decay. Might work, right? That's the kind of thing that's going on here. But one of those two is going to happen. And then when you can't do those 2 things, if they don't play into it because you already used them, or you're just in a really bad situation, you engulfed nobody, they all made their save or something like that. Lashing Glob just lets you make a pseudopod attack to someone within 30, which could be inside of you. So, that's fun. So lashing Goop does the pseudopod attack. That's just your default attempt, and that's kind of cool. So that's kind of the monster in and of itself, and really I've kind of broken it down, right? That's really what you're doing. You're looking at moving in a way that you're going to be able to use your Restraining Globs to pull things into you. Then you're going to move with the engulf and hopefully get a bunch of people engulfed so they're restrained. The ideal situation is just the whole party inside of you restrained, taking damage. You're doing that decay legendary and just dropping a whole bunch of damage in there. The fun of it is going to be your explanations of all these different things that are doing that are all goopy and globby and terrible, and even the names are sort of funny, which will add some levity to it. Describing how you're destroying all the terrain around you, and putting the characters in positions from where they can do heroic stuff to, teleport out of there, or help each other out, or heal each other, but maybe they, jump into the blob to heal their buddy or whatever, depending on how you run with the healing stuff. So there's just a lot of opportunity for fun here. So we've seen the lore, the stat block. Let's talk a little bit about the types of encounters we can set up with this kind of Blob of Annihilation and how that figures into the tactics, right? This thing, as we said, can be enormous. And being enormous could be interesting in a number of ways. One is when it's very large, it presents almost a front, right? And so it's going to roll across the battlefield. And you can only kind of retreat from it because you won't be able to go around the edges much. So it's a thing to think about whether we want characters to try to go around it or just the feel of this enormous thing just sweeping down as it moves forward. That actually might be more fun and more effective, though it can be fun when characters can move around. But, starting it on one side of a battle map and just moving forward, I kind of like that a lot. I might try that first if I were designing this encounter. And again, I'm coming up with this because of the idea of how it moves and attacks, and it's trying to engulf things. That means it's sort of moving forward, and it's less effective if I have to triangulate, right? If I'm moving around from side to side on a battlefield and characters can move around me, that's less effective. But if I'm almost a wall moving forward, now they can only run away from me, and I can use my ranged attack to pull them 60 feet towards me. Only monks are going to outrun that. So that's something to think about, right? How much you want to do that. And maybe it would even be good to have its corner on one kind of entering in and sort of sweeping across. That could actually be kind of effective, sort of like a wedge. That could be kind of neat to bring it in versus just a whole side. But, that's where I start thinking about that. And I think about also the mobility of the PCs. Like if I make this, several blocks wide or let's say 2 blocks wide, and then I have like some blocks of houses drawn on a battle map, will characters be able to move around those effectively? And they might, if it's destroying things as it moves, the blob is destroying things, such that the characters can kind of like leap across ruins and move across, but it's difficult terrain. That could work. Plus, a lot of them will fly or have tricks. So, that might actually work to be sort of having a city that's been semi-destroyed or is semi-destroyed because of the blob coming up on it. And that allows them to sort of move through things as difficult terrain. That could have some potential. But you don't want to make it so the characters feel like they can't move at all. But the reality is, this thing's moving at least 60 feet with its movement and engulf. It's going to cover some terrain. And so I wouldn't overly create a set piece encounter where I couldn't kind of move things back, if you will. Like if if you set, like, say, a town square with a fountain, well, it'd have to be really far away to not just get somehow engulfed and where you forget worrying about it. So I'd probably do more featureless terrain that almost would be like scrolling terrain, like just the columns of buildings. And then they can, just the thing can go across it. I could even move the map back up if I needed to have more terrain because we're all moving down away from it. That could be interesting. With its range of 600 feet for this Restraining Glob, that's just kind of easily off the map, right? I don't expect characters to be 600 feet away. I don't want that. I want them to be somewhat close to it as it comes up. Almost like a regular encounter, but then that shock of, oh, wow, this thing can actually move a fair bit and can pull us into it is kind of cool. It doesn't have any amazing movement, right? This is not a thing that's going to teleport onto a tower or anything like that. It really is taking things over. So that's where I think something like the terrain of a bunch of houses and destruction work. But what we can do is we might say, what if there are things in various houses that need saving? Like maybe this is the museum ward, and there are a couple of things that need rescuing from the buildings that are easy to get to, right? So you don't spend round upon round saving them, but a thing like, get in there and, grab this one holy scepter and then go into the other area and grab the most important book, or, the sage is trapped under a pile of rubble, get them out. That kind of thing can work. It is important that at level 16, we want to not have this feel like rats in a basement, right? So we don't want it to be like, oh, spend your whole turn lifting up a bookshelf. Instead, we want it to be like, I'm a 16th level character and I have awesome ways to save people. So be very flexible with what works so that they feel cool, because you shouldn't be like losing the battle because you had to lift up bookshelves to save a sage. It's the point of being cool, right? Looking cool rather than eating up all your actions. This monster is deadly enough, we hope, with proper tactics that it should not rely upon, the characters having to just waste their turn on something. Whereas in lower level fights, it can be really cool to have weak foes that are maybe like mephits that are setting things on fire, and the characters spend actions to put out the fires, right? That can be rewarding because it's that mix of what makes the battle work. But here, I think, we're going to be engulfing stuff. There's going to be a lot of denial anyway inside of it. So you don't want to eat up too many actions with other things to do on the map. There could be, however, though, some NPCs that are helping. That could actually work in a number of ways. Like maybe NPCs can help the party, but also it gives more opportunities for those legendary actions to kick in because they are creatures that will end their turn. So that's a thing to consider that you could do. And maybe you can, get a few people to safety and things like that. That's just very quick, and then get them out of the way and then focus on it. But to me, this is probably more of a straight up fight with this sort of engulfing pieces here. You could do something interesting though, like maybe if you're in a place where, like, let's say it's the remains of let's say this is the wizard's quarter, where people study and research and things like that, and you had some things like some teleportation pads that let you go from one place to another. That could actually be useful as ways to make the tactics pay off. Maybe you even have to activate at the beginning of the encounter. Like if you can get to the blah, turn the statue, activate the teleporters, and now you can get, even when you're inside a particular part of the blob, you could move to where that teleporter is, even inside of it, if you can get out of the restrain, and then you could get to the get to that teleporter and get out there and so on. That could be kind of cool. Or if you want to jump around it because it's going to come at you and you want to move, spread out so you're not all in one piece to all be engulfed together. So some kind of teleportation thing or option like that could be kind of neat to have. But that's kind of it. This is the kind of monster that's pretty much about rolling up onto you and pulling you inside. So those are the kind of ideas I have. But I'm curious what you think, having seen this. And I should say, for all those kind of tactical analyses, this is me just taking a look at it fairly fresh. What neat ideas do you have, right? How would you run this? What kind of terrain would you set up for the Blob of Annihilation and to make the most of it? I'm curious to hear. Or if you happen to have already run one, let me know how it went. Thanks so much.